What's the cruelest punishment you received as a kid? My parents let my older brother decide if I was sick enough to miss school. I was lying on the bathroom floor with blood soaking through my jeans when my older brother Evan knocked on the door and told me I had 15 minutes to get dressed for school or he'd drag me there himself. The cramps had woken me at 4 a.m., so severe I'd vomited twice already, and now I was passing clots the size of my fist. I was 14 years old and this was my 5th period ever, but something was very wrong. I managed to call out that I needed mom, that something was happening, that I was bleeding too much. Evan's voice came back cold and dismissive. You always say that. I'm not falling for the period excuse again. You have 13 minutes now. I heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway, and I pressed my forehead against the cold tile, trying not to pass out from the pain radiating through my abdomen. The rule had been in place since I was 11, 3 years of my older brother having final say over whether my symptoms were real enough to warrant missing school. It started after I had mono during his junior year homecoming week, when he'd been nominated for homecoming king. I'd been genuinely sick, diagnosed by our family doctor with Epstein-Barr virus, so exhausted I could barely lift my head. But Evan had convinced our parents I was exaggerating to steal attention from his big week. He'd just gotten early acceptance to MIT, and my parents treated everything he said like gospel. He was the golden child, the genius, the one with the 4.0 GPA and perfect SAT scores. I was the average younger sister who occasionally got B's and didn't have any particularly impressive talents. So when Evan started complaining that I was faking illnesses to get out of school and make everything about me, my parents listened. After the mono incident, my father sat me down at the kitchen table and explained the new household rule. Your brother has excellent judgment and superior critical thinking skills. From now on, if you claim you're too sick for school, Evan will assess whether you're genuinely ill or just trying to avoid responsibilities. We trust his evaluation. My mother nodded her agreement, adding that this would teach me not to be manipulative about my health. I'd tried to argue that the doctor had confirmed the mono, that I hadn't been faking, but they dismissed it. Evan had already told them I'd probably looked up symptoms online and convinced myself I was sick, that I was a hypochondriac seeking attention. At 11 years old, I learned that my own parents valued my brother's opinion of my health more than my actual lived experience of my body. The pattern started small, a stomach bug that Evan declared was just me wanting to skip a math test, so I went to school and vomited in the hallway outside my second period classroom. A sprained ankle from soccer practice that he said was minor, so I limped through 3 days before the school nurse insisted my parents take me for an x-ray that showed a hairline fracture. A fever of 101 that Evan claimed I'd faked by holding the thermometer near a light bulb, though I hadn't, and I ended up with strep throat that took 3 rounds of antibiotics to clear because we'd waited 5 days for treatment. Each time, my parents backed Evan's assessments. Each time, I learned that arguing was pointless. My brother had decided my pain threshold, my symptom interpretation, my bodily autonomy, and our parents had handed him that power without question. Now, at 14, bleeding on the bathroom floor with cramps that felt like my organs were being shredded, I knew Evan wouldn't believe me. Period pain wasn't real to him, just something girls used as an excuse. He'd said so explicitly last month when I'd asked to stay home during my 4th period. He'd examined me from across the room, decided I looked fine, and sent me to school where I'd bled through my pants during English class and had to tie my sweatshirt around my waist in humiliation. When I'd come home crying, he'd told our parents I was being dramatic about normal biological functions, and they'd agreed that I needed to toughen up. So I knew before I even tried that this morning would be the same. But the amount of blood was terrifying me, and I needed help regardless of what Evan thought. I managed to stand, clutching the sink for balance, and wrapped a towel around my waist over my soaked jeans. I stumbled out of the bathroom and down the hall to my parents' bedroom. Dad was already gone for his morning shift at the hospital where he worked as an anesthesiologist, which meant only Mom was home. She was sitting at her vanity putting on makeup, dressed for her job as a real estate agent. When she saw me in the mirror, her expression shifted from neutral to annoyed. "Sweetie, you should be getting ready for school. What are you doing out here?" I tried to explain about the blood, about the pain, about something being wrong, but she cut me off. "Have you talked to Evan?" I said I had, that he'd dismissed it, and she stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Well, if Evan says you're fine, then you're fine. He's pre-med at MIT. He understands medical symptoms better than you do." I wanted to scream that Evan was 18 years old and a college freshman, not a doctor, that taking introductory biology didn't qualify him to diagnose anything. But I'd learned that arguing with Mom about Evan's authority only made things worse. She walked past me toward the stairs, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Get dressed. You're going to be late." I stood there in the hallway with blood running down my legs, soaking through the towel, and I made a decision. I was done asking permission to take care of my own body. I went back to my room, changed into clean clothes with the heaviest pad I could find, and packed my school bag. Then I grabbed my phone and texted my best friend Zara, asking if her mom could pick me up early and take me to the urgent care clinic before school. Zara's mom, Dr. Indira Kapoor, was a psychiatrist who'd always been kind to me. She'd noticed bruises on my legs once after Evan had shoved me down the stairs for being in his way, and she'd asked careful questions that I'd deflected because I didn't know how to explain that my brother was allowed to hurt me as long as it wasn't serious enough to leave permanent damage. Zara had texted me back within 2 minutes saying her mom would be there in 10. I sat on my bed watching the clock, trying to breathe through the pain, and when I heard the car horn outside, I grabbed my bag and left through the front door. Evan was in the kitchen eating cereal, and he shouted after me asking where I thought I was going without his approval. I didn't answer. I just got in Dr. Kapoor's car and started crying before she'd even pulled away from the curb. Dr. Kapoor took one look at me, and instead of heading to urgent care, she drove straight to the emergency room at Mercy General Hospital. She'd asked how much blood I'd lost, and when I described what I'd seen, her face had gone pale. She kept her voice calm, but I could hear the concern underneath. "That's not normal menstrual bleeding, honey. We need to get you checked immediately." In the ER, a nurse named Patricia Whitfield took my vitals, and I watched her frown at the numbers. My blood pressure was low, my heart rate elevated, and when she asked me to rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10, I said 8 because I was afraid if I said 10, they wouldn't believe me. Patricia disappeared and came back with a doctor, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun who introduced herself as Dr. Helena Vasquez, attending physician with 23 years of emergency medicine experience. Dr. Vasquez asked me questions while examining me, her hands gentle but thorough. When was my last period? How heavy was the bleeding? What did the clots look like? Had I passed out or felt dizzy? When did the pain start? I answered everything honestly, and I saw her expression grow more serious with each response. She ordered blood work and an ultrasound, then asked if my parents were aware I was here. I explained about the rule, about Evan's authority over my medical care, about how I'd left the house without permission because I knew he wouldn't let me come. Dr. Vasquez set down her clipboard and looked at me directly. "I need to be clear about something. No teenager, no matter how smart, is qualified to make medical decisions for a minor. That's not appropriate, and it's potentially dangerous. What you're describing is called medical neglect." The words hung in the air between us. Medical neglect. I'd never thought of it that way. I'd just thought of it as the rule, as something unfair but unchangeable, as part of the hierarchy of our household where Evan's judgment superseded mine in all things. Dr. Vasquez continued, "I'm required by law to report situations where a child's health is being endangered by parental decisions. What you've described meets that threshold." She pulled out her phone and stepped away to make a call, and I sat there on the examination table in a hospital gown, my clothes in a bag marked biohazard because they were so blood-soaked, and I felt this strange combination of relief and terror. Relief that someone was finally taking my pain seriously. Terror about what would happen when my parents found out I'd gone around Evan's authority. The ultrasound revealed I had a large ovarian cyst that had ruptured, causing internal bleeding. Dr. Vasquez explained that I needed emergency surgery to stop the bleeding and remove the damaged tissue. Without treatment, I could go into shock or develop sepsis. This wasn't period pain or teenage dramatics. This was a genuine medical emergency that my brother had dismissed as attention-seeking, that my mother had ignored because Evan had said I was fine. Dr. Vasquez had already called my parents by the time the surgical team was prepping me, and I could hear my mother's voice in the hallway outside my room, high-pitched and defensive, demanding to know why she hadn't been called first. Dr. Vasquez's response was crisp and professional. "Your daughter presented with symptoms of a serious medical emergency. We treated the emergency. You're welcome to be present for the surgery consult." My mother came into the room looking flustered and angry, my father behind her still in his scrubs from the hospital where he worked. Dad worked in a different hospital system, but he knew enough to understand the seriousness when Dr. Vasquez explained about the ruptured cyst and the internal bleeding. His face went pale and he asked how long I'd been symptomatic. When I said the pain had started at 4 a.m. and it was now almost 10, he looked at Mom with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mom immediately went on the defensive. Evan said she was fine. He evaluated her this morning and determined she was using her period as an excuse to skip school. We trusted his medical judgment. Dr. Vasquez's expression hardened. "Your son is 18 years old and has no medical training. He's not qualified to evaluate anyone, let alone deny emergency care to a minor with acute abdominal bleeding." Dad asked to speak with Dr. Vasquez privately, and they stepped into the hallway. Through the partially open door, I could hear him trying to explain about Evan's intelligence, about MIT, about how they'd implemented the evaluation system to prevent me from manipulating them with fake illnesses. Dr. Vasquez's voice cut through his explanations. "Dr. Monroe, you're a physician. You know that no amount of intelligence substitutes for actual medical training and examination. Your daughter has been bleeding internally for hours because you delegated medical authority to an unqualified teenager. If she'd waited much longer, we'd be looking at emergency transfusions and possibly organ damage. This is not acceptable parenting, and it's certainly not acceptable from a medical professional who should know better." The silence that followed was heavy, and when Dad came back into the room, he wouldn't meet my eyes. The surgery went smoothly according to the surgeon, Dr. Marcus Chen, who removed the ruptured cyst and stopped the internal bleeding. I woke up in recovery with IV lines in my arms and Dr. Kapoor sitting beside my bed. She smiled when she saw me awake and squeezed my hand gently. "You're going to be okay. They got everything cleaned up." She told me that Zara was in the waiting room with my parents, that someone from hospital social services wanted to talk to me when I was feeling up to it, and that Dr. Vasquez had filed the mandatory report with Child Protective Services. My stomach dropped at that last part. CPS meant investigations and interviews and my family being scrutinized, and I knew Evan would blame me for bringing outside attention to our household. Dr. Kapoor must have seen the fear on my face because she leaned closer. Hey, this isn't your fault. You sought appropriate medical care for a genuine emergency. The adults in your life failed to provide that care. You did exactly the right thing. The CPS caseworker arrived the next morning while I was still in the hospital for observation. Her name was Jennifer Okafor, a black woman in her 40s who carried a tablet and spoke in this calm, measured way that made me feel slightly less terrified. She explained that the hospital's report had triggered an investigation into medical neglect, and she needed to understand the full scope of the situation. I walked her through the rules history, starting with the mono when I was 11, listing every instance I could remember where Evan had denied me medical care, and my parents had supported his decision. Jennifer typed notes on her tablet, occasionally asking clarifying questions. And your parents never questioned your brother's assessments, even when you were later proven to have genuine illnesses? I shook my head. They said Evan was smarter than me and understood medical things better, that I couldn't be trusted to evaluate my own symptoms. Jennifer's face remained professionally neutral, but I saw her jaw tighten when I described the fractured ankle I'd walked on for 3 days, the strep throat that had required multiple antibiotic rounds, the concussion from falling downstairs that Evan had said was just a headache. She asked if Evan had ever physically harmed me, and I hesitated before describing the shoving, the times he'd grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, the incident where he'd twisted my wrist when I'd tried to call Dad about a fever Evan had dismissed. Did you report these incidents to adults? I explained that I'd tried telling Mom once, but she'd said siblings roughhoused sometimes and I shouldn't be so sensitive. That Evan was just frustrated with my constant need for attention. Jennifer made more notes, and then asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you feel safe going home? I didn't know how to answer that. Home was where I slept, where my things were, where I'd lived my entire life. But it was also where Evan had complete authority over my well-being, where my parents had consistently chosen to believe him over me, where my pain was subject to someone else's approval. I don't know, I finally said, and Jennifer nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected. She explained that CPS would be conducting a full investigation, interviewing my parents and Evan, reviewing my medical records, and speaking with other adults in my life like teachers and doctors. In the meantime, she was placing a safety plan that prohibited Evan from having any medical decision-making authority over me. My parents would be required to seek immediate medical attention if I reported symptoms, regardless of Evan's opinion. If they violated the safety plan, I would be removed from the home and placed with a foster family or relative. My parents were furious about the CPS involvement. Mom kept insisting this was a misunderstanding, that they'd been trying to teach me personal responsibility, that they'd never intended for me to be hurt. Dad was quieter, but I could see the anger in the tight line of his jaw, the way he avoided looking at Jennifer when she outlined the safety plan requirements. Evan showed up at the hospital that evening, storming into my room with his face red and his voice loud. Do you have any idea what you've done? CPS is investigating our family because you couldn't handle normal period cramps. You're destroying Mom and Dad's reputations over nothing. I tried to explain about the ruptured cyst, about the internal bleeding, about this being a genuine emergency, but he talked over me. You probably caused the cyst yourself by being dramatic and stressing your body. This is just another example of you making everything about you. A nurse must have heard the yelling because she came in and told Evan he needed to leave. He ignored her, still ranting about how I'd betrayed the family, how I'd gotten Dr. Kapoor involved when this was none of her business, how I was going to ruin his reputation by association when word got out that CPS was investigating our family. The nurse called security, and 2 guards arrived to escort Evan out. As they walked him toward the door, he turned back and said something that made my blood run cold. When you come home, you're going to regret this. I'll make sure of it. The nurse, whose badge read Linda Chen, immediately wrote down exactly what he'd said and noted the time. She told me she'd be including this in her report to CPS, that threats against a minor under investigation constituted a serious concern. I felt simultaneously protected and more afraid because Evan didn't make empty threats. I was discharged after 3 days with strict instructions for rest and follow-up appointments. Dr. Kapoor offered to have me stay with her family for a few days during recovery, and Jennifer supported this as part of the safety plan, giving my parents some space to process the investigation while ensuring I had appropriate supervision. Zara's house was peaceful in a way my own home had never been. Dr. Kapoor checked on me regularly without being invasive, making sure I was taking my pain medication and getting enough rest. Zara sat with me watching movies and bringing me snacks, and her younger brother Amit made me a get-well card with elaborate crayon drawings. It felt like being part of a normal family, one where being sick or hurt was met with care instead of suspicion. On the 4th day, Jennifer came by for a follow-up interview. She'd completed the initial investigation and wanted to share her findings. She'd interviewed my teachers, who confirmed I'd come to school visibly ill on multiple occasions, and had been sent home by the school nurse over the past 3 years. The nurse, Mrs. Patricia Yang, had kept detailed records of every time she'd seen me, including dates, symptoms, and notes about my parents' responses when she called them. Those records showed a pattern of my parents initially dismissing the nurse's concerns until she became insistent, at which point they'd grudgingly agree to pick me up or take me to a doctor. Mrs. Yang had noted in several instances that she'd heard a male voice in the background during calls, presumably Evan, coaching my parents on what to say to minimize my symptoms. Jennifer had also interviewed my primary care physician, Dr. Robert Fraser, who'd been our family doctor for 10 years. He'd pulled my complete medical file, and the pattern was damning. Multiple instances of delayed treatment for conditions that should have received immediate care. Notes in the file where he'd documented concerns about my parents' slow responses to serious symptoms. A notation from 2 years ago where he'd asked my mother directly why she'd waited 5 days to bring me in for obvious strep throat, and she'd explained about Evan's evaluation system. Dr. Fraser had apparently documented that he'd advised against this practice, that minors needed prompt medical attention for acute illnesses, but my mother had dismissed his concerns. The doctor told me he'd considered calling CPS himself on 2 previous occasions, but had given my parents the benefit of the doubt, assuming they'd course correct. He deeply regrets that decision now. Most significantly, Jennifer had interviewed Evan. She played me an audio recording of part of the interview, and listening to my brother's voice through the tablet speaker made my hands shake. He was completely unapologetic, explaining in his measured, intellectual tone that he'd been protecting our parents from my manipulative behavior, that I had a documented history of exaggerating symptoms to gain attention, that his evaluations had been scientifically sound based on observable evidence. When Jennifer had pointed out that multiple of his evaluations had been proven wrong by subsequent medical diagnoses, he'd dismissed those as outliers, or claimed I'd probably made myself sicker by worrying. When she'd asked about the ruptured ovarian cyst, he'd actually argued that there was no way to prove I'd been in severe pain that morning, that I could have been experiencing minor discomfort and had catastrophized it in my mind. Jennifer stopped the recording and looked at me with something like sadness. Your brother shows no insight into the harm his actions caused. He genuinely believes he was helping your parents by gatekeeping your medical care. That level of conviction combined with his intelligence makes him a very effective manipulator. She explained that based on the evidence, CPS was substantiating the medical neglect allegations against my parents. They'd be required to attend parenting classes, submit to regular home visits, and comply with all aspects of the safety plan. Evan would be prohibited from any involvement in my healthcare decisions, and any violations would result in my immediate removal from the home. If I chose to return home, that is. Jennifer made it clear that I had options, that Dr. Kapoor had agreed to serve as a temporary placement if I didn't feel safe going back. The decision was harder than it should have been. Part of me wanted to prove I could handle living at home, that I was strong enough to stand up to Evan now that CPS had put protections in place. But another part of me remembered his threat in the hospital, remembered years of him finding subtle ways to punish me for perceived slights, and I knew he'd make my life miserable if I came home right now. I told Jennifer I wanted to stay with the Kapoors for a few more weeks, at least until I was fully recovered from surgery and strong enough to defend myself if needed. She approved the extended placement and scheduled weekly check-ins to assess the situation. School became complicated after word got out about the CPS investigation. In a small town like ours, everyone knew everyone's business, and people had opinions about the Monroe family situation. Some of my classmates were supportive, telling me they'd always thought the rule about Evan approving my medical care was weird. Others, particularly kids whose parents were friends with my parents, started spreading rumors that I was lying about everything to get attention, that I'd probably faked the ovarian cyst somehow, that I was destroying my family for drama. The worst were the people who defended Evan, talking about how smart he was, how responsible, how he'd probably been trying to help, and I'd twisted everything to make him look bad. My locker got vandalized with the word liar, written in permanent marker, and I found notes in my backpack calling me a family-destroying bitch. Zara and her friends formed this protective barrier around me at school, shutting down rumors when they heard them and making sure I wasn't alone in hallways or bathrooms where people might confront me. But the social damage was real. I'd lost friends whose parents had forbidden them from associating with me, worried that I'd make false allegations against their families too. Teachers looked at me with either pity or suspicion depending on their relationship with my parents. My chemistry teacher, Mr. Donald Harper, who'd been my dad's college roommate, started grading my work more harshly and making comments about how disappointing it was when students manipulated systems for personal gain. It was isolating and exhausting, and some days I wanted to take everything back, to say I'd exaggerated and my family was fine, just to make the social nightmare stop. But then I'd remember lying on the bathroom floor bleeding, remember Evan's dismissive voice through the door, remember my mother's annoyance when I'd asked for help, and I'd know I'd done the right thing. Dr. Vasquez had been clear that delayed treatment for a ruptured ovarian cyst could have killed me. The only reason I was alive and recovering was because I'd gone around my brother's authority and sought care anyway. That wasn't manipulation or family-destroying drama. That was survival. Jennifer reminded me of this during our weekly check-ins, helping me process the social fallout without internalizing the blame people were trying to put on me. You were a child being denied necessary medical care by the adults responsible for your well-being. Speaking up about that isn't betrayal, it's self-preservation. 6 weeks after the surgery, my parents requested a family therapy session to discuss the possibility of me returning home. Jennifer set it up with a therapist named Dr. Marcus Osei, who specialized in family reunification after CPS involvement. The session was held at his office, a converted house with comfortable furniture and soft lighting that was probably meant to be calming, but just made me more anxious. My parents sat on one couch. I sat on another with Jennifer beside me, and Dr. Osei sat in a chair between us with a notepad. He explained the ground rules about respectful communication and gave everyone a chance to share their perspectives. Mom went first, crying while she talked about how much she missed me, how the house felt empty without me, how she'd never meant for me to be hurt. Dad spoke about recognizing they'd made errors in judgment, about understanding now that Evan wasn't qualified to make medical decisions, about wanting to rebuild trust. Then it was my turn. I'd prepared what I wanted to say with Jennifer's help, and I'd practiced staying calm and factual. I explained that I'd felt unheard and dismissed for 3 years, that my pain had been subject to someone else's approval, that I'd learned my own assessment of my body couldn't be trusted. I described specific instances where Evan's denials had led to worsened conditions and delayed treatment. I talked about the fear of being seriously ill and not being believed, about the ruptured cyst that could have killed me if I hadn't gone around the system they'd created. When I finished, Mom was sobbing and Dad was staring at his hands. Dr. Osei asked them what they'd heard from what I'd shared, and there was a long silence before Dad spoke. We heard that we failed to protect you, that we prioritized Evan's perspective over your actual well-being, that we created a system that put you in danger. It was the first time either parent had really acknowledged the harm without adding justifications or explanations about their intentions. Mom nodded through her tears, adding that she'd been so worried about me manipulating them that she'd stopped seeing me clearly, that she'd let Evan's confidence override her own instincts as a mother. Dr. Osei asked what changes they'd made since the investigation started. Dad listed the parenting classes they'd attended, the reading they'd done on medical neglect, the family therapy sessions they'd been having with just them and Evan to address his role in the situation. Mom mentioned they'd installed a direct line for me to call them if I ever felt unsafe or needed medical attention, bypassing any evaluation from Evan. They'd also made it clear to Evan that he no longer had any authority over my care, and that any attempts to interfere would result in him being asked to move out. But Dr. Osei pushed further. What consequences has Evan faced for 3 years of denying his sister necessary medical care? My parents exchanged looks and Mom's answer was hesitant. We've had serious conversations with him about appropriate boundaries. He's agreed to respect the new rules. Dr. Osei's expression suggested this wasn't sufficient. Your son repeatedly made medical decisions that endangered your daughter's life. He showed no remorse when confronted by CPS. What message does it send if his only consequence is being asked to stop? Dad got defensive, talking about how Evan hadn't understood the seriousness, how he'd thought he was helping, how he was still their son and they couldn't just punish him for trying to be responsible. I felt my chest tighten listening to them defend him again, falling into the same pattern of prioritizing Evan's intentions over the actual harm he'd caused. Jennifer cut in before I could respond. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe, I need to be direct with you. Your daughter is sitting here having survived emergency surgery for a condition her brother dismissed as period cramps. She has documented evidence of years of medical neglect that your son actively perpetuated and you enabled. If she returns home and Evan faces no real consequences, what incentive does he have to actually change his behavior? What guarantee does she have that the same patterns won't resume once CPS supervision ends? The room went quiet. Dr. Osei asked me what would make me feel safe enough to consider returning home, and I'd already thought about this. I told them I needed Evan to acknowledge what he'd done, not just agree to follow new rules. I needed him to understand that his evaluations had been wrong, that they'd caused real harm, that he'd endangered my life, and I needed to see actual consequences, not just conversations and agreements. My parents looked uncomfortable. Mom said she couldn't force Evan to apologize if he didn't feel he'd done anything wrong, that trying to make him would just create more family conflict. Dad added that Evan was an adult now, living at home while commuting to MIT, and they couldn't exactly ground him or take away privileges. I pointed out that they'd had no problem giving Evan complete authority over my medical care when he was 15, but now that he was 18, they suddenly couldn't hold him accountable for abusing that authority. Dr. Osei noted this inconsistency in his notes, and I saw my parents realize how this looked. The session ended without resolution, with Dr. Osei recommending we continue family therapy weekly to work toward rebuilding trust, but acknowledging that I had valid concerns that needed to be addressed before reunification. I stayed with the Kapoors through the end of the school year. The weekly therapy sessions continued, and they were uncomfortable and often frustrating. Evan attended some of them at Dr. Osei's insistence, and watching him in those sessions was illuminating. He'd used therapy speak he'd clearly researched, talking about communication breakdowns and different perspectives, but never actually admitting fault. When Dr. Osei would press him on specific instances where his evaluations had been medically wrong, Evan would intellectualize, saying that medical diagnosis is imperfect and he'd made reasonable assessments based on available information. When confronted with the fact that I'd needed emergency surgery, he'd argue that acute abdominal emergencies are difficult to diagnose even for professionals, and he couldn't have known from observing me through a bathroom door. The turning point came during a session in late May. Dr. Osei had obtained permission to have Dr. Vasquez join us via video call to provide medical context. She appeared on the screen in her white coat, speaking from her office at the hospital, and she'd reviewed all the documentation from my medical history over the past 3 years. She walked through each instance where Evan had denied me care, explaining what the appropriate medical response should have been, what delays in treatment had caused, what risks I'd faced. When she got to the ruptured ovarian cyst, she pulled up my surgical photos on screen. The images were graphic, showing the internal bleeding and the damaged tissue. This is what was happening inside your daughter's body while your son was telling her she was faking period cramps for attention. Another hour, maybe 2, and we would have been looking at a very different outcome, possibly fatal. The room went absolutely silent. My mother made a small sound and covered her mouth. My father's face had gone pale. Evan stared at the screen, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw something crack in his confident facade. Dr. Vasquez continued, her voice professional but firm. I understand that you're an intelligent young man with good intentions, but intelligence doesn't substitute for medical training, and good intentions don't negate harmful outcomes. You repeatedly denied your sister necessary medical care based on superficial observations and assumptions about her character. That's not scientific reasoning. That's bias confirmation, and it nearly killed her. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. I've seen cases of medical neglect before, but I've never seen parents deliberately delegate that authority to a sibling. This wasn't just parental oversight. This was systemic abuse enabled by your entire family structure. After Dr. Vasquez logged off, Dr. Osei asked Evan directly how he felt hearing a medical professional's assessment of the situation. For the first time, Evan didn't have a smooth answer ready. He sat there for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I didn't think it was that serious. I thought she was exaggerating like she always did. Dr. Osei pushed back. But multiple medical professionals diagnosed her with serious conditions after you denied her care. At what point did you question whether your assessments might be wrong? Evan's answer revealed everything. I couldn't be wrong. If I was wrong, that meant I'd been hurting her for years. That meant Mom and Dad had been trusting someone who was causing harm. So I convinced myself the doctors were being overly cautious, that the diagnoses were borderline, that she'd probably made herself sicker by worrying, because the alternative was too horrible to accept. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was the first real acknowledgement I'd heard from Evan that he'd been operating from a flawed premise. Dr. Osei worked with this opening, asking what Evan understood now about the impact of his actions. Evan's response was halting, uncomfortable, but more honest than anything he'd said before. He talked about realizing that he'd been so invested in being right, in being the smart one whose judgment was trusted, that he'd ignored evidence that contradicted his assessments. He admitted that there had been times when he'd suspected I might really be sick, but had dismissed those suspicions because acknowledging them would mean admitting he'd been wrong before. And he said, looking directly at me for the first time in weeks, that seeing the surgical photos had made the abstract consequences real in a way nothing else had. I could have killed you. I didn't think I was doing anything that serious, but I could have actually killed you. The sessions after that were different. Evan started actually engaging with his role instead of deflecting, talking about the pressure he'd felt to be the perfect child, the way our parents' constant praise of his intelligence had made him believe his judgment was infallible, how he'd resented me for needing attention and care when he was supposed to be the focus. He admitted he'd liked having authority over me, that it had made him feel important and trusted. Dr. Osei helped him understand how those feelings had created a dynamic where he'd been incentivized to find me dramatic and attention-seeking, because every instance where I was really sick threatened the narrative he'd built about his superior judgment. My parents had to sit with their role in creating this dynamic, acknowledging how their treatment of Evan as the golden child and their dismissal of my needs had set up a system where abuse was inevitable. By the time summer started, we'd made enough progress that Dr. Osei thought a trial return home might be appropriate. Jennifer agreed, with strict conditions. I'd have monthly CPS check-ins for the next year. My parents had to complete the full parenting class series. Evan had to continue individual therapy to address his need for control and his difficulty with being wrong. And everyone had to sign an agreement that any medical concerns I raised would be immediately evaluated by an actual medical professional, with no interference from Evan. If anyone violated these terms, I'd be removed immediately and placed back with the Kapoors. I moved back home in mid-June, and the house felt both familiar and foreign. My room had been left exactly as I'd had it, but everything else felt different, tentative, fragile. The first few weeks were awkward. Evan and I didn't know how to be around each other now that the power dynamic had shifted. Mom kept asking if I was okay about every little thing, overcompensating for years of dismissing my concerns. Dad tried to bond with me over medical discussions from his work, as if proving he understood medical seriousness now would somehow make up for trusting Evan's assessments for 3 years. But slowly, we found a new rhythm. Evan started college counseling at MIT, working with a therapist who specialized in perfectionism and control issues. He'd come home on weekends and actually ask how I was feeling, and when I'd mention being tired or having a headache, he'd immediately ask if I'd taken anything for it, or if I needed to see a doctor, overcorrecting in the other direction. The real test came in August when I woke up with severe chest pain and difficulty breathing. My first instinct was still to downplay it, to tell myself it was probably nothing, because 3 years of having my symptoms dismissed had taught me not to trust my own assessment. But I remembered Dr. Vasquez's words about speaking up, about not letting their past neglect make me ignore future warning signs. I went downstairs and told my parents I was having chest pain and needed to go to the hospital. Mom grabbed her keys without question. Dad called ahead to the ER to let them know we were coming. Evan, who was home for the weekend, offered to drive so Dad could sit with me in the back seat and monitor my breathing. No one asked if I was sure, if I might be exaggerating, if this was real enough to warrant emergency care. They just acted. The ER doctor, a young South Asian man named Dr. Rajesh Patel, ran tests and determined I had costochondritis, an inflammation of the cartilage connecting my ribs to my sternum. Painful but not dangerous, treatable with anti-inflammatories and rest. As we were leaving, Evan pulled me aside in the hospital parking lot. "I'm glad you told them. I'm glad you didn't wait to see if it got worse. I know that's because of what I did, making you afraid to speak up. And I'm sorry. I'm going to keep being sorry for a really long time." It wasn't a complete fix. Years of trauma don't heal because someone finally apologizes. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was a start. The CPS case officially closed after a year of successful home visits and compliance with all safety plan requirements. Jennifer came for one final check-in, sitting in our living room with the whole family present. She reviewed the progress we'd made, the therapy everyone had completed, the changes in family dynamics. Then, she addressed me directly. "You advocated for yourself when no one else would. That took incredible courage. I want you to know that the system failed you initially by not catching this sooner, but you didn't fail yourself. You survived, and you made sure what happened to you won't happen to anyone else in this family. That's powerful." She closed her case file and stood to leave, shaking everyone's hands. As she got to Evan, she looked at him seriously. "You were given authority you weren't qualified to hold, and you abused it. The fact that you're taking responsibility now is important, but it doesn't erase the harm. Keep working on yourself. Keep examining your need to be right over being kind. That's lifelong work." I'm 17 now, preparing for college applications. The physical scars from the surgery have faded to thin white lines on my abdomen. The emotional scars take longer. I still sometimes hesitate to say when I'm not feeling well, still have to consciously push past the trained response that my symptoms need external validation to be real. Dr. Osei and I work on this in the individual therapy sessions I've continued. He helps me understand that my body is mine to interpret, that pain is subjective and valid regardless of whether someone else can see it, that I don't need permission to take care of myself. Some days I believe him completely. Other days I still hear Evan's voice from 3 years ago telling me I'm being dramatic, and I have to actively choose to trust myself instead. Evan and I have something resembling a relationship now, though it will never be what it was before. He's a junior at MIT, still brilliant, still achieving, but he's also in therapy twice a week, working through the perfectionism and control issues that made him so dangerous to me when we were younger. He calls sometimes to check in, and our conversations are careful but genuine. He asks about my college plans, and I tell him about schools I'm interested in, programs I might study. He's been honest about how hard it is to accept that he was abusive, that his intelligence was weaponized against his own sister, that our parents' trust in him was misplaced. His therapist has helped him understand that being smart doesn't make you good, that the two things are completely separate, and that he spent years conflating them in ways that justified hurting me. My parents and I have rebuilt something too, though trust is still fragile. They've done the work, attended every class, every therapy session, examined their parenting with a depth that clearly pained them. Mom has been especially committed to change, joining a support group for parents who've been involved with CPS and learning from other families' experiences. Dad has used his medical knowledge to educate other physicians about recognizing medical neglect in families where parents might otherwise seem responsible and capable. They speak at conferences sometimes, sharing our story as a cautionary tale about how even educated, well-intentioned parents can create dangerous dynamics. It's uncomfortable for everyone, making our family's dysfunction public, but they feel it's necessary restitution for what they allowed to happen. The hardest part has been reconciling who my family is now with who they were during those 3 years. Dr. Osei calls it holding paradox, the ability to acknowledge that people who love you can also harm you, that abuse can coexist with good intentions, that healing doesn't require erasing history. My parents loved me while simultaneously allowing my brother to endanger my life. Evan thought he was protecting our parents while actually abusing his sister. These things are both true, and I've had to learn to hold both truths without letting either one define everything. Some days that feels possible. Other days I just feel angry about the years I lost to their dysfunction, about the medical trauma that could have been prevented, about the permanent damage to our family relationships. I'm applying to pre-med programs, which surprises people who know my history. Wouldn't I want to avoid medicine after everything? But actually, I want to work in emergency medicine like Dr. Vasquez, to be the doctor who listens when someone says they're in pain, who takes symptoms seriously regardless of who's doubting them, who recognizes medical neglect and intervenes. I've spent 3 years since the ruptured cyst learning everything I can about patient advocacy, about medical ethics, about the systems that either protect or fail vulnerable people. I volunteer at the Children's Hospital, helping young patients understand their diagnoses and treatments, making sure they know their voices matter in their own care. It's healing work, turning my trauma into purpose. The college essay I'm writing focuses on medical advocacy and patient autonomy. I don't mention my family by name, but I write about a teenage girl who learned that her pain needed permission, who survived an emergency that was dismissed as dramatics, who had to fight for the basic right to care for her own body. I write about systems that fail children when adults prioritize compliance over well-being, about the courage it takes to advocate for yourself when everyone tells you you're wrong, about the medical professionals who saved not just her life but her understanding of herself as someone whose experiences are valid. It's a strong essay, my English teacher says. It's honest and powerful and will make me stand out to admissions committees. It's also the truest thing I've ever written, even with the identifying details changed. Zara and I are still best friends, closer now than we were before everything happened. She witnessed the worst of it and stayed anyway, her family opening their home when mine was unsafe. Dr. Kapoor still checks on me regularly, always making sure I know their guest room is available if I need it. That safety net matters more than I can articulate, knowing that I have places to go, people who will believe me, backup plans if my family reverts to old patterns. It lets me engage with healing without feeling trapped, without worrying that if this new version of my family doesn't work, I'll have nowhere else to turn. Jennifer also stays in touch, sending me occasional emails about other cases she's worked where families successfully rebuilt after CPS involvement. She wants me to know that healing is possible, that our story isn't unique in having hope after harm. Last month was the 3-year anniversary of the surgery. I'd expected it to be a hard day, full of traumatic memories and anger, but instead my family did something I didn't anticipate. Evan came home from college specifically for the weekend. My parents made my favorite dinner, and after we ate, we sat in the living room and each person shared what they'd learned in the 3 years since that morning. Dad talked about how his medical training had made him arrogant about his ability to evaluate situations at home, how he'd trusted Evan's clinical judgment instead of his parental instincts. Mom spoke about her fear of being manipulated that had made her easier to manipulate by Evan, about learning that children need unconditional belief in their experiences, not conditional belief pending evaluation. Evan went last. He'd prepared something and he read it from his phone, his voice shaking slightly. He talked about intelligence as ego, about how being called gifted his whole life had made him believe he was qualified for things he wasn't, about the specific ways he'd failed me as a brother and as a human being. He listed each instance he could remember where he'd denied me care that I'd needed, naming them specifically rather than generalizing. Strep throat during junior prom, the fractured ankle during debate finals, the concussion he'd called a headache, the ruptured ovarian cyst he'd dismissed as period dramatics. He took responsibility for each one, acknowledged the harm of each one, and explained what he understood now that he hadn't understood then. When he finished, he looked at me directly. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I deserve forgiveness for endangering your life repeatedly over 3 years, but I want you to know I'm committed to being different, to never again believing that my intelligence makes me right about things I'm not trained to evaluate. I'm sorry. I'll keep being sorry, and I'll keep working to be someone worthy of your trust again someday. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust Evan again. Trust isn't something you rebuild quickly after it's been shattered so thoroughly, but I appreciate that he's trying, that he's doing the uncomfortable work of acknowledging specifically what he did, rather than hiding behind generalizations about mistakes. Dr. Osei has been helping me understand that forgiveness isn't required for healing, that I can acknowledge someone's growth while still protecting myself from them, that moving forward doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. So when Evan finished his prepared statement, I didn't say I forgave him. I said, "Thank you for saying that. Thank you for being specific. Keep working on yourself." And that felt honest in a way that premature forgiveness wouldn't have been. I leave for college in 2 weeks. I'll be 3 hours away, close enough to visit but far enough to have independence. My parents are anxious about me leaving, worried that this means I don't trust them, that I'm running away. But Dr. Osei has helped them understand that my leaving is actually a sign of healing. I'm confident enough in my own well-being to pursue my goals rather than staying close to manage their anxiety. I'm excited for this next chapter, for building a life where my medical autonomy isn't questioned, where I can seek care when I need it without navigating family dynamics, where I'm just a student and a person rather than a victim and a survivor. Though those identities will always be part of me, they don't have to be the center of everything. The night before I leave, I go down to the basement and find the box where Mom saved cards and mementos from my childhood. In it is a birthday card from Evan from 6 years ago, before everything started, when we were still just siblings who occasionally fought but generally got along. He'd drawn a picture of us as superheroes, me with healing powers and him with superintelligence, fighting villains together. I stare at that card for a long time, at the version of us that could have been if different choices had been made, if systems hadn't failed, if authority hadn't been weaponized. That version of us is gone, replaced by this more complicated reality where we're both trying to be better than what we became. I tuck the card back in the box. Some things you keep not because they make you happy, but because they remind you of what you survived and what you're still surviving. And sometimes that's enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.